The man dug his fingers into the ground, unable to move an inch. He had been lying on the ground for 48 hours. The slightest mistake would mean certain death, as behind him was a 100-meter high cliff, but the sand was too soft and he couldn't hold on. His whole body slid toward the cliff. His hands were completely useless, so he had to use his face as a brake to stop himself. But just then, the phone in his backpack rang. Should he answer it or not? What if it was his wife calling? Not answering would be 100 times worse than falling off the cliff. But if he raised his hand even slightly, his body would slide down. So he adjusted his position, pressed his face tightly against the ground, and switched hands to reach for the phone. Finally, he managed to grab it. But the next second, the man found himself stuck at the edge of the cliff. Below the cliff were dark, sharp rocks. After another 2 hours, the combined physical and mental exhaustion had pushed him to the brink of collapse. Suddenly, he began muttering to himself. It turned out he was calculating the cycle of the waves crashing against the rocks. If he could use the seawater as a buffer, there might be a chance to survive. Silently calculating the time, the man let go and leaped with all his strength. He successfully plunged into the sea, but due to the shallow water, his hips collided with the rocks. The immense impact left him unconscious, but fortunately, he regained consciousness in time. Using his last ounce of strength, he finally managed to surface. However, the real test had only just begun. After safely reaching shore, he carefully examined his body. Apart from a cut on his hand, there seemed to be no other issues. But when he stood up, he took just one step. After regaining his composure, he noticed another wound on his head. But that wasn't the worst of it. Due to the impact on his waist when he fell into the water, his legs had lost sensation. At that moment, he remembered he hadn't returned his wife's call. He quickly pulled his phone out of his bag, but it had been severely water damaged. No matter how he pressed the buttons, there was no response. This was truly the end. He could only shout for help at the top of his lungs. However, how could anyone come to such a remote island? In front of him was a steep, vertical cliff, and behind him was an endless ocean. There was no way out. He could only take off his short-sleeved shirt and first treat his wounds. To conserve energy, the man lay down on the rocks and slowly fell asleep. When he opened his eyes again, he calmed down. The intense pain in his waist reminded him that he had to act quickly. He began to observe his surroundings. Climbing up the cliff was impossible. Fortunately, there was another small island in the distance. This was his only hope for survival. He mustered all his strength. He rolled his body and successfully got into the sea. Things were not as simple as he had thought. His legs had lost sensation, and one of his hands was seriously injured. He could only slowly move forward with his other hand. He hadn't swum for long. Before his strength gave out, he had to stop and rest on the surface of the sea. Just then, he felt a sharp pain in his abdomen. The man choked on a mouthful of water and slowly sank toward the ocean floor. In the moment before death, he thought of his wife once more. He refused to accept dying like this. His intense will to survive unleashed his latent potential. He swam upward with his single hand and finally returned to the surface. However, reaching the small island was no longer possible. He could only return to his original location.